Hey, everybody. Today is Friday, April 30th, and you are tuning in to find out what you're doing today. Hopefully, the test went well yesterday. I will work on those as soon as I can, and hopefully, you got yourself off to a nice start on the Decade That Roared Roaring 20s assignment. And you didn't have too many problems or any questions. So, the point of this video today is to run you through basically everything you need to worry about for this class and to make sure that you are doing the things that you need to do. Okay, so kind of the gist for today is we're going to run through the introduction or the introductory stuff to the Roaring 20s. I'm going to go through about 2 or 3 slides with you guys, and then you can use the rest of the time to work on the Roaring 20s assignment. If for some reason you were to get that done, which would be great, if you've got other work that you need to make up for me, you could do that as well. Now, if you don't get the Roaring 20s done today, that isn't due till Monday at midnight, so make sure you get that thing done. So, again, get in that late work. If you have time left at the end, make sure you get that done. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little brief intro to the 1920s, and then we're going to look at women's suffrage, and then we're going to look at a second industrial revolution, and then you guys will have the rest of the time to work. If you have any questions, as always, you can always reach out. I am driving today again, so you can message me, and when I get a chance to stop or take a break in my drive, I will answer you back. So here we go. All right. So this chapter on the Roaring 20s is going to be kind of a quick one. The Roaring 20s are an interesting and kind of a little bit wild time trapped in between World War I and the Great Depression. So they're in that 21-year gap between the wars. And there are a lot of comparisons made between the Roaring 20s and kind of the world that we live in. And I think part of the reason that is made isn't just that we're in the 20s again. I think that the reason is that in the late teens, there had been a pandemic, masks, a lot of death around the world, a lot of worried about people's safety and health. We're obviously living through that now. But the 20s were also a time when a lot of technology took off and made life better and easier. They had, talking movies for the first time. We have YouTube. They had, the beginnings of a lot of things that we use today and have improved on many times. The 20s were also a time when there was a lot of unrest regarding racial issues in the country that we'll talk about later in this unit, but again, very similar to things going on in our country today. There was a little bit of political divide leading up to the Great Depression, and obviously we've dealt with some political divide in the last little chunk of years here. Society got very into Hollywood and sports and music and fame for being famous, and those are definitely some things that we have a tendency to kind of focus in on today. Now, the clip that's playing over and over again is from a silent movie. If you can imagine, before the late 1920s, movies did not have soundtracks that went along with them. Sometimes someone would play the piano in the movie theater while the movie rolled, or sometimes there'd be like a record that would play, but there was no spoken dialogue that went along with things. So when an actor moved their mouth, no words came out, and every once in a while a black screen would come up with some words on it. Not like today with subtitles at the bottom of the screen. If you've ever watched a foreign film and the words are in English on the bottom of the screen, they didn't do that. The man in the chair is probably one of the big, not probably, he is one of the big stars of the 1920s. His name is Charlie Chaplin. And if you're wondering about his Hitler mustache, take in mind that at this point, that would have been a Charlie Chaplin mustache because Hitler was not a big global person at this point. Okay. All right. So, to talk about the 1920s, one of the things we're going to do first is we're going to go back a little bit. And when we talk about the 20s, we're going to look at things kind of like from some different themes. And one of the big themes of the 1920s is minority groups' rights, minority groups' struggles, and trying to get closer to the idea of equality. Well, one minority group who saw a big positive change right before and into the early 1920s were women. And the women's suffrage movement in particular. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this word, we've talked about this a couple of times this year, but just in case it's not ringing a bell, suffrage means women's right to vote, rights to vote. In this case, women's suffrage is the women's right to vote. And so what I need you to understand is we're at a time in American history in 1919 where men, regardless of color, could vote. Now, not Native Americans, they're the last group of people, but it didn't matter if you had been a slave, you could vote. It didn't matter if you were, as long as you were a man, you had the right to vote at this point. Women did not have the right to vote in national elections. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. In 1868, when the 15th Amendment was passed, and the 15th Amendment was the amendment that gave men of different colors the right to vote, a women's group suggested something called the Anthony Amendment. Now, that Anthony Amendment is named after Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony is one of the leading suffragettes of that time. She was big into the feminist movement and things like that, so things were named after her. The Anthony Amendment was introduced to Congress in 1868, and basically what it said is that votes shall not be denied on account of sex. So that if that would have passed, women would have been allowed to vote. However, when it got to Congress, Congress was predominantly, if not all, white men, older white men, and very kind of traditionally in the way of thinking that women didn't need to vote because, one, this is their ideas, not mine. Please do not point the finger at me on this. Women weren't intelligent enough to make that kind of decision. A number of people thought that giving a woman the right to vote was a waste because they would just vote exactly how their husband told them to do. So there's no sense in letting women vote because it would just be a double vote for women who were married, or girls would vote the way that their fathers told them to vote. People also thought that maybe women were too emotional to be allowed to vote. And so that was not ever passed. Now, it hadn't been the first time that women had attempted to get the right to vote, and obviously it wasn't the last. And so things progressed. By 1916, 11 states allowed women to vote in state or local elections. Now, those 11 states were all out west, okay? Now, if you think about it, there's a number of reasons why Western states might allow women the right to vote. Women might be allowed the right to vote because that would count as a population boost towards statehood. But in a lot of cases, when a family moved out west, the woman had to do just as much hard work to help establish the family, to help build the homestead, to help get themselves there, that women were valued more as equals in the West. Back in the beginning of the school year, we talked about the role that women played. We watched a little bit of Adam Ruins Everything, I believe, and talked about the role that women played in the West. And so women were more valued. They were seen more as equals in the West because they put in more time. Now, that's not saying that all men in the West thought women were equal and deserved the right to vote. Okay. Now, right after that point, right after 1916, the United States joins World War I, as we just got done learning about. When men go overseas to fight, a number of women have to take on roles in factories and at different jobs that women might not usually do. They helped build weapons. They helped direct traffic like police. They worked in different factories. They did all the things to help keep society going, on top of also helping their families, keep moving in the right direction. When the war ended, men were really impressed. In some cases, women went back home. In some cases, they stayed in the workplace. But a lot of people think that the role that women played in the success of World War I may have helped spur the women's suffrage movement back into the public eye. On the other side, a lot of people would say that the women's suffrage movement never went away, that there had been protests and calls and talks to government members about why women deserve the right to vote, and that they had just finally gotten heard. Regardless of what you think, maybe it's a combination of all of the above. On June 19th, 1919, the Anthony Amendment passes. Now, it is then ratified by states in 1920. All right. Now, what I need you to understand, there's a couple of things here. First of all, it's not known as the Anthony Amendment because amendments to the Constitution are numbered. Okay. And so the Anthony Amendment stops being the Anthony Amendment and starts to be the 19th Amendment. Now, one of the things that I've always found very fortunate about that is June 19th, 1919, the 19th Amendment passes. You've got all these 19s. It makes it easier to remember. Okay. Now, once an amendment passes through government, it still has to go out to the states to be accepted. Ratified means that it gets voted for and accepted by a certain number of states. Now, not every state has to agree to this. And so in 1920, when 36 states agreed to give women the right to vote in all federal elections, it passed through the states and it became an addition to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. Now, some places, and this is totally useless trivia, believe that a woman named Mary Byram from Hannibal, Missouri was the first woman to vote in a national election. Regardless, women have turned out in high numbers, higher numbers sometimes than males, in every election since then. Women play obviously a major role in the process of democracy. And obviously, since women have the right to vote, more and more and more women start to get elected to important government positions, because now you can vote for people who are going to represent you. You can vote for people who look like you, who act like you, and women support women. Okay. And so that has a major impact not only on history, but on the way that people look at the 1920s, because along with this, and later in the unit, we'll talk a little bit more about the relaxation of maybe some cultural tradition towards women, and women doing things like cutting their hair and dancing and smoking in public and going out without their husbands or their fathers. And so the 20s is considered to be a time of, some people call it a time of rebellion for women, and some people call it a time of like acceptance for women. And as we look at this, I think one of the big parallels that we can draw here is we still have a fight for equal rights that maybe we don't pay attention to as much for women. Later on, we do civil rights movements. We'll talk about an equal rights amendment that has never been passed for women. We'll talk about the pay gap for women, the number of male CEOs of important companies versus the number of female CEOs of important companies, and why those things aren't balanced. You may have even heard, if you're into sports, that the U.S. women's soccer team is not paid near what the U.S. men's soccer team is paid, even though the women are far more successful. And so this is a struggle that continues 100 years later. However, women are given the right to vote, or earn the right to vote. Now, our last topic area for today, before I give you the rest of the time to work on the Roaring 20s, or the 1920s, I can't remember exactly what I called it, is that the other thing about the 1920s is the 1920s sees a big rise in industrialization in America. Once World War I ends, we don't need to make tanks and airplanes and bullets and boats and submarines anymore. And so factories turn their attention back to making items that people will want and items that their company traditionally makes. And so in the early 1920s, we have the beginnings of what some people refer to as the second industrial revolution. The first came when factories started to mechanize, started to use machines instead of just the hand labor of men and women and children in the beginning. In the early 1920s, our techniques for manufacturing items become more modern and more updated. And because of that, the new techniques cause the production of goods in some businesses to as much as double. Now, some of the concepts that become a thing during the 1920s that help industrialization along are, first of all, the idea of the assembly line. Now, I'm sure that assembly lines have existed in some way, shape, or form since the dawn of time. You do this, and I do that, and you do that, and you do that. But they really became famous as we know them when Henry Ford started to use the assembly line in his Ford Motor Company factories in Michigan. And what Ford was really trying to get at was, in the beginning, it's not just you specialize, which we'll get to in a minute, and do a certain part of the job. It was bringing the work to the worker. All right. I can sit here in this chair and they can bring the car along to me using a conveyor belt, which is like the thing at grocery stores that you put your groceries on, a large one, or possibly even a conveyor on the, from the ceiling that would bring things along in front of me so I could work on certain car parts. And then when I'm done, they can move along to the next station to be worked on. And so the assembly line was more efficient. Okay. It brought the work to you. You didn't have to pick up heavy pieces. They were right by you and you could assemble things, and then they would move on to the next person to be worked on further. And Ford loved this for his cars because the early cars, and we'll talk about these a little bit next week, I'm not going to say they were simple, but they're way more simple than they are now. And so it cut the assembly time in half. And the benefits of that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, that conveyor belt, obviously, like I said, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're talking about the thing you put your groceries on at the grocery store or things on at Target, and they push a button and it goes right up to where they check it. The conveyor belt can bring the work to you. One other thing that made the assembly line even more efficient was the idea of specialization. And specialization, very simply, is where a worker learns to do one part of the job. They become an expert at doing that one thing, and they do it over and over and over and over and over and over all day long. Okay. So, like, for instance, if we were sitting in the Ford Motor Company around 1920, and I'm sitting in my spot and you're sitting in your spot down here, my job might be, as the car frame comes along, I put on the front passenger tire. Meanwhile, you're sitting about 3 or 4 feet away from me. You're putting on the rear passenger tire. The car on the other side, they're putting the tires on. The car goes further down the assembly line and someone puts in the windshield. Someone puts in the driver's seat and the passenger seat. Someone puts on the trunk door. Someone helps drop in the radiator. And so we do that same job over and over again. And I know what you're thinking. That would be mind-numbingly boring, and you are probably correct. But I'm going to get really good at it, super efficient, and I'm going to become an expert in how to do that thing. Now, when you combine together the idea of the assembly line and the conveyor belt and specialization, and even something called interchangeable parts, where we start to use cheaper things, like, for instance, I was just eating a little mini Crunch bar. These, when I was a kid, used to come in little foil wrappers. Now these are these little, like, plasticky, papery wrappers. The reason they use this is they're going to save money. This is a cheaper option, okay? This mask is a cheaper option to, like, an N95. And the idea being that we can put in a cheaper part and be able to save money in the production process. We're able to make more faster. And so what happens is, as the supply goes up, these items become more popular and the demand goes up. So the supply and the demand go up. Usually in that case, the price is going to go down because there's going to be more available. But because the company is able to make a bigger profit, workers' pay is going to go up. So there's an obvious benefit to the worker. First of all, factories become safer. When you're more specialized, you're more likely to be able to do your job safely. The machines go a long way. Owners like Ford and like others around the country start to care more about the safety and well-being of their workers. Unions have taken over. But the biggest thing that happens here is there's a huge pay increase. In 1900, the average American factory worker made about $418 a year. That's a year. That's not a month. That's not a week. That's a year. Now, if you think about that, that's pathetic. You can do the math. If you wanted to do 52 weeks times 40 hours a week, you're going to get like 2,000 something, and then divide 418 by that, and you're going to find out that you're not even making probably 50 cents an hour. Okay. By 1920, that's tripled. It goes up to $1,342. So in a 20-year span, pay increases by 300%. If you don't understand that, 300% would be like if I had a dollar bill and I put it in my pocket, and when I reached in, I had $3. Okay. That increase is as a result of this industrialization. So some people have more money to spend. Now, what I need you to understand is that's still not a lot of money. Even by their standards, that's still not great. That's $1,342 a year. Okay, that's if I divide it by 52, I'm getting, it's like still less than $30 a week, I think. Quick math. Sorry if I made a mistake there. Okay. Now, not everybody gets that same benefit. White men were making the $1,342. Other minority men were making the next level, which I think was right around $1,000. white women were about 8 to 900, and minority women were more like in the 700 range, because there was no universal minimum wage and there were no laws saying that you had to pay people equally back then. So not everybody got those benefits, all right? And also something that changes in the industry, in the industrial world, is factories, like I said, switch from making those war goods to making consumer goods. Now, that's a new term, consumer goods, right there. And consumer goods are products that satisfy individual wants and needs. So if you think about that, we're talking cars, we're talking toasters, we're talking all the appliances in your house, maybe toys for your kids. The things that people not only need to do their jobs, but the people want to be able to relax in their homes. And so there was less focus on what do we have to make and more focus on what can the business make that's going to sell, that's going to make money. And so not only do you see more goods produced fast, you're going to see more of a variety of goods produced fast. Whereas World War I, you might not have that same option. After World War I, there's going to be more raw materials to be able to use on toys or dresses for women or appliances, instead of making ammunition and helmets and things like that. Now, that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Hopefully you've gotten those couple of slides down. Hopefully you've listened to me and gotten some ideas about what's going on early in the 1920s. If you did, you should stand up and do the Charleston if you know how to do that. That'd be a good celebration dance for the 1920s. Now, what I want you to spend the rest of the time doing is I want you to work on the Roaring Twenties assignment that you got yesterday. Okay. Now, if you got done with that, yay. If you owe me work, you can work on that. If you got done with the Roaring Twenties and you don't owe me any work, chances are that you are ahead of the game anyway, and I can trust you to be able to kind of sit and do your thing. Please be respectful of the substitute teacher. I really appreciate that. If you guys have got any questions, you could obviously ask the sub to see what they think. Maybe they know something about history, or you could, message me, or we can wait till Monday when I'm back sitting here in this probably same seat. Okay. Have a great weekend. Check posts on Monday just in case. Otherwise, get to work on the Roaring Twenties. I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.